Hello, everyone. Welcome to this event. My name is Rosario Galarza. I am the Intersectionalities Officer in International Disability Alliance, and I am also representing the stakeholder group of persons with disabilities. Welcome to our event, Toward Inclusive Societies, Making Data and Statistics, Disability and Gender Inclusive. I will start with some few housekeeping rules. This event will be recorded. International sign, French and Spanish interpretation and live captioning in English are provided. The international sign interpreter is spotlighted and the captioning is available by clicking on the closed captioning box on the bottom of the screen, and also available in a separate link that has been shared in the chat box. Presenters and the moderator will use their cameras while presenting, but for others, we ask that you turn off your camera, please. Throughout the event, ask questions by writing in the chat box on the bottom of the page. I would like to start by saying that women and girls with disabilities are one of the most marginalized groups in the world and are often excluded from society in various ways and face multiple intersecting forms of discrimination. For example, women and girls with disabilities are up to 10 times more likely to experience gender-based violence than women and girls without disabilities. Despite this, there is a lack of data on women with disabilities, and that's difficult to create inclusive policy and programs for women and girls with disabilities. In our event, we still highlight examples of how data can identify gaps that are not addressed through policies and to provide examples of success. For example, the 2022 Disability Data Report of the Disability Data Initiative will be launched with results in inequalities between women with and without disabilities regarding education, personal activities, health standard of living, multidimensional poverty, insecurity, and subjective well-being. Additionally, there will be presentations from panelists with experiences of disability and gender and data processes, including the experiences from organizations of persons with disabilities and the use of qualitative data. Now, let's present our distinguished panel, which includes Sophie Mitra and Jacqueline Yap, who are from the Disability Data Initiative Research Consortium on Disability from Fordham University. We also, then I will be presenting, myself will be presenting about statistics, women with disabilities and qualitative data. Then we have Monjur Kabir, is a UN Coordination Advisor in Gender Equality and Disability Inclusion from UN Women. Then we have Julia Constance Brown-Miller, is a private sector development specialist in women business and the law project from the World Bank. Then we have Claudia Capa, is a senior advisor in statistics and monitoring from UNICEF. And then we have Vandana Chaudhary, is an associated professor in the Department of Social Work at the City University of New York College of Staten Island. Then we have Gisela Berger, is the WISH Global Technical Manager, Kampala, Uganda, from Humanity and Inclusion. I will now pass the floor to Jackie and Sophie, who will be present the findings from the 2022 Disability Data Report. Please, Sophie and Jackie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rosario, for this introduction. My name is Sophie Mitra. I am a middle-aged woman with gray hair and wearing a maroon blouse. In this presentation, Jacqueline Yap and I will give you an overview of the results of the 2022 Disability Data Report of the Disability Data Initiative. This is the work of a team including 7 very dedicated and talented students at Fordham University and Princeton University and myself. I would also like to thank the steering committee for their invaluable guidance and encouragement, as well as the Wellspring Philanthropic Fund for funding support. Next slide. You can access the 2022 Disability Data Report at this link, https://bit.ly/2022DDI. Next slide. So like last year, the report starts with a review of the questionnaires of national censuses and household surveys that countries use to produce national statistics. We covered the 2009 to 2021 period. We found that only 1 in 5 of the data sets under review have disability questions that meet international standards of comparability. That is, those that collect information on functional difficulties in 4 to 6 domains as per the 2017 United Nations recommendations for censuses. Only 1 in 10 of the data sets have the internationally tested and comparable Washington Group short set of questions. Recently, the inclusion of the Washington Group short set of questions in the 6th round of UNICEF's multiple indicator cluster survey program has improved data availability for many countries. Next slide. This slide shows a map of the world with countries where we found national data sets with functional difficulty questions in green. Such questions are in national data sets in all regions of the world, but more often they were not found in Europe and Central Asia. Next slide. Overall, much work remains to be done for national surveys and population censuses to have functional difficulty questions to implement Article 31 of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which requires that state bodies, quote, collect appropriate information, including statistical and research data, to enable them to formulate and implement policies to give effect to the convention, end of quote. So international survey programs, for instance, the COVID-19 high frequency phone survey program or the survey of income and living condition program could help to improve the availability of disability questions in many countries and to inform policies. So now we move on to the results of the analysis of survey data with Jacqueline.
Hi, everyone. I am Jacqueline Yap, and I am a young Asian woman with black hair. I wear glasses, and right now I am wearing a black dress. So the methods used in the microdata analysis are explained in the methods brief section, and the main results at the country level are summarized in country briefs. We use the UNICEF Multiple Indicator Cluster Survey, or MIX Round 6. MIX collects data to monitor the situation of women and children around the world. We use 35 microdata sets from countries in different regions and of varying development levels. This study covered over 418,000 women aged 18 to 49 years old in urban and rural areas who responded to the adult functioning module. This screen shows the world map with the 35 countries we used in this study shaded in blue. These include countries as diverse as Georgia and Belarus in Europe, the Dominican Republic and Honduras in Latin America, Mongolia in Central Asia, and Madagascar, Lesotho, Central African Republic, and Chad in Africa. We aim to find out inequalities between women with disability and women with no disabilities. We measured disability based on the 6 functional domains of the Washington Group short set: seeing, hearing, walking, cognition, self-care, and communication. We disaggregated our data in different ways. For our main results, we compare women in 3 groups: women with no difficulty, women with some difficulty, and finally, women with at least a lot of difficulty. We estimated 32 indicators of well-being, which we categorized into 7 dimensions: education, personal activities, health, standard of living, multidimensional poverty, insecurity, and subjective well-being. We use descriptive statistics and bivariate analysis in the report. I want to share with you some of our key findings. Some results confirm what we already know. For instance, in education, consistent with findings in our previous report and with the literature, women with functional difficulties tend to have lower educational attainment and literacy rates. For standard of living, we considered indicators such as access to clean cooking fuel, access to electricity, and adequate housing, to name a few. We found gaps for only some countries, which may be due to sample composition, since we included higher income countries with relatively high levels of development, where clean cooking fuel or electricity are almost universally achieved. For multidimensional poverty, our estimates suggest that persons with functional difficulties on average experience multiple deprivations at higher rates than persons without any functional difficulties. In addition to these results that confirm earlier quantitative studies, we are able to provide statistical results that, to our knowledge, are new with nationally representative data for women with functional difficulties for many countries. For health indicators, we find that 46%, 43%, and 39% of women with no difficulty, some functional difficulty, and at least a lot of difficulty, respectively, report having their family planning needs met. We also found that 30% of women with no difficulty saying that a husband is justified in hitting his wife. This is lower than 35% of women with some difficulty and 37% of women with at least a lot of difficulty. For insecurity, fewer women with functional difficulty report feeling safe walking alone in their neighborhood after dark, compared to women without functional difficulty. We also found that 23% of women with at least a functional difficulty report feeling discriminated against, compared to 17% of women with some difficulty and 10% with no difficulty. For personal activities, we examined indicators such as access to information and access to information and communication technologies, or ICT. Overall, we found that there is no disability gap when access is low. However, in countries with higher overall access rates, our results demonstrate a digital divide between women with and without functional difficulties in most countries. For example, mobile phone ownership among women with no difficulty is at 69%, compared to 61% and 60% for women with some difficulty and at least a lot of difficulty, respectively. Finally, for subjective well-being across countries, we found that having any functional difficulty is significantly associated with a lower score for life satisfaction and a lower share of women reporting that they are very happy or somewhat happy. Our findings lend support to the disability and development gap hypothesis. According to this hypothesis, inequalities between persons with and without disabilities become larger as countries develop due to development processes that are not inclusive, for instance, in education or in the labor market. As more kids stay longer in school and perhaps attend or finish secondary school, that progress might not be realized for children with disabilities. If this hypothesis is true, then inequality should be larger for countries at higher levels of development. This is something we confirmed for some indicators only, in particular multidimensional poverty, That is the share of women who experience multiple deprivations, such as low educational attainment and inadequate housing. The graph on the slide illustrates the correlation between the Human Development Index and the disability gap in multidimensional poverty. That is the difference between women with and without disabilities. For some indicators, we find a graded association between the severity of functional difficulty and of disadvantage. In other words, women with some functional difficulty are on average worse off than women with no difficulty, but better off than women who report a lot of difficulty or unable to do in at least one domain. That is, for instance, the case for educational attainment, multidimensional poverty, and subjective well-being. We need to keep shining a light on women with some functional difficulty, as they may be disadvantaged and cannot be assumed to be similar in terms of well-being outcomes as women with no difficulty.
So to conclude, the 2022 Disability Data Report first demonstrates that disaggregation of national survey data by disability status is feasible, even among a subgroup of the population. In this report, it was women aged 18 to 49. In addition, the results overall show that more data collection, research, and policy work are necessary to curb the inequalities that women with disabilities face. The mixed program has broad visibility to women with disabilities aged 18 to 49 in many countries. Other survey programs need to include functional difficulty questions to make, for instance, older women with disabilities visible. The 2022 report shows inequalities among women with and without disabilities in two dimensions of well-being on which we had little to no data so far. First, insecurity, in particular measured by the share of women feeling unsafe and the share of women feeling discriminated against. And second, subjective well-being measured through happiness or life satisfaction indicators. These indicators reflect deprivations and barriers that women with disabilities face around the world that may be worsening in the context of the climate crisis and the pandemic, and where more work is necessary to realize SDG number 5 to end all forms of discrimination and violence against women and girls, as well as to realize the CRPD. Next. We look forward to feedback from panelists and the audience to inform our future work. Questions or feedback is welcome at rcd@fordham.edu. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jackie and Sophie, for this wonderful presentation. Definitely, it's very important that you said that it's really feasible to have disaggregated data in case of women and girls with disabilities. Well, now I will present about the, okay. Sorry, I'm going to, it seems to be that my video is not on. Let me put here, okay. Okay, thank you, sorry, it's a technical issue. Okay, I will present now about the relevance of qualitative data of women and girls with disabilities. Women and girls with disabilities face countless barriers across the globe, including exclusion from participation in economies, a significant increase of risk of violence and abuse, lack of access to justice, minimal participation in political and public lives, and facing discriminatory attitudes in sexual health, reproductive rights, and in the right to family life. Despite these myriad barriers, there is a lack of data on women with disabilities. Little or no data means it is difficult to create policy and programs inclusive of women with disabilities who may be most at risk of being left behind. Conversely, high quality, timely, reliable, and available disability data are needed to understand the real situation of women with disabilities, to identify gaps that are not addressed through policies, and to provide examples of success. One way to address this data gap has been the collection of use of qualitative data, including citizen-generated data from OPDs and NGO allies to complement official statistics to measure gaps and progress. This use of qualitative data is especially important in emergency situations, such as during the COVID-19 pandemic, of which I will now share 3 examples. The first example comes from findings from the COVID-19 Disability Rights Monitor Survey on disability rights during the pandemic. The survey findings suggested that women and girls with disabilities were disproportionately affected by the pandemic and experienced specific rights violations due to the interaction of discrimination on the basis of disability, gender, identity, and age. The survey received testimonies of great human rights abuses, which included example forms of multiple discrimination, assault, and violence. There were reports of sexual assault, domestic violence, and police brutality against women and girls with disabilities. Respondents shared that their governments did not take measures to safeguard the rights of women and girls with disabilities. The pandemic has made the situation even worse because women and girls could not access police, women's shelters, social workers, or trauma counseling during the pandemic, and they were isolated at home with abusive partners or relatives and with no access to school or to workplaces. The second example is from the stakeholder group of persons with disabilities, qualitative research on the experiences of persons with disabilities on the context of the pandemic. The first research phase carried out interviews and focus groups with global disability movement leaders and state, and in the second phase, researchers with disabilities carry out in-depth interviews with persons with disabilities in Bangladesh, in Bolivia, and in Nigeria. Some of the data gathered was on the experiences of women with disabilities, such as due to the pandemic and lockdown measures, women with disabilities generally had a much higher risk of physical and sexual abuse, including domestic abuse, similar to the DRM survey. Deaf women also had a higher risk of domestic violence and the additional barrier of lack of access to information in sign language and no way to call to get help. Many women with disabilities encounter barriers in accessing and engaging in society, and thus it was challenging to gather detailed information, especially around the topic of disability-related discrimination. Universally, the researchers found it challenging to reach the most marginalized person with disabilities, including women with disabilities, to interview. Thus, there were barriers in even reaching women with disabilities to gain their perspective. The third example is from the World Blind Union that carried out a global survey about challenges and resilience strategies for blind and partially sighted people during the pandemic. The survey was both qualitative and quantitative, as it included open and ended questions, and the Washington group short set enhanced. More than 800 people responded to this survey. Findings around blind and partially sighted women include that overall blind and partially sighted women indicated more challenges than any other gender group. These challenges included loss of independence and choice, autonomy and dignity, challenges related to health, particularly among women aged 25 to 45 years old, negative attitudes from others, and additional barriers from women living in rural settings. Blind and partially sighted women also responded higher on having solutions involving personal supports, networks, getting online, and being practical, while men responded notably higher than any other gender group on solutions involving personal well-being and OPD support advocacy. As is evident from these rich findings, the use of data, both qualitative and quantitative, are essential and critical in the understanding the gaps, barriers, and progress for women with disabilities and all persons with disabilities. We look forward to collaboration more in this area. I would like to make a reflection about that. It's very important to identify these gaps in order to overcome these barriers, attitudinal, environmental, and institutional barriers that women and girls with disability face all the time. Thank you so much. Now I will pass the floor to Monjur Kabir, who will be presenting now. Please, Monjur, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me, Rosaria?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
So to describe myself, I'm a middle-aged Asian man with black hair and black and white beard. With black and blue glasses, I'm wearing white shirt. Thank you very much for inviting me, inviting you and women. I'm very pleased to be part of today's launch event, critical disability data report of the Disability Data Initiative. For us, disability data is more than just numbers. While numbers are important, it tells the story of people, life. And I think in the development discourse, what we are now finding out as we are also working on the SDG implementation, the lack of data is nothing new. And we all talk about lack of disaggregated data. But often we also miss the whole aspect of the stories that the data tells. And we don't connect sometimes our operational response and the stories that it tells. That's why the data is so powerful, which is often underutilized in terms of storytelling. And it's more important for women and girls with disabilities for specific reasons. Some of my previous speakers already alluded to. As you have just heard, this report presents results on inequalities between women and with and without disabilities regarding education, personal activities, health, standard of living, multidimensional poverty, insecurity. And all of these tell a lot of stories. Increasingly, global reports do not limit itself highlighting discrimination directed at one group or a few categories only. They go further, for example, raising concern regarding gender and disability. And so therefore an intersectional dimension. For us, that is critically important because disability is gendered, affecting men and women differently. And the report that my colleagues here, Sophie and others are working on is also telling of that. While disability correlates with disadvantages, not all people with disabilities are equally disadvantaged. Women and girls with disabilities experience the combined disadvantages associated with gender as well as disability, and maybe less likely to more if you compare them non-disabled women. So that's one important aspect sometimes we don't remember in our development assistance as well. There's also a higher prevalence of disability among women compared to among men. According to the World Report, the prevalence of the disability worldwide is 12%, whereas the prevalence of female disability is 19%. Now, these statistics, to many of you who are attending today, is well known. But the reason I sometimes use these statistics in many audience where it is, we sometimes take this for granted, but it is not. Many of them don't understand the dynamics of these simple statistics as well presence. During the COVID time, one of the hard hit area is violence against women because it's experienced by women, but particularly women with disabilities from our case studies, projects from our reporting from UN Women country offices, we realized that happened throughout 2020, 22, and 21 a lot. Therefore, the report like this gives us further evidentiary value, how we want to connect this with programming response as well. Overall, the disadvantages that women with disabilities face within their economics and societies and economies highlight the need for policies, data, and research that support their rights and well-being. And I'm raising these issues with different constituency as well from our organization, so that any planning that is happening today for next 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, factor this in the budgeting as well, because the tendency is to not to factor them in and then try to fix it later on through adding a certain component or trying to divert a little bit of resources from here and there. And those type of ad hocism will not really produce or sustain the SDGs that we spoke about, right? Now, since policy is only ever as good as data that inform it, expanding gender data collection will play an important role in ensuring women's needs at the center of any response to any crisis, whether it is COVID-19 that we really learned in a hard way, disaster management, humanitarian action, and increasingly peace and security response in many countries where UN is operating at the mission level and member states are also struggling with capacities. And any peace building effort, any peace negotiation that happens, we don't see presence of women with disabilities or women and girls in general. And that is where this type of also the data has a value, not necessarily it has a different angle from a conflict zone or from a transitional society aspect. But even if you present in general, you then can make a leap in terms of your evidentiary understanding. Now, the findings confirmed the report that I have looked at in terms of draft report, confirmed that uneven impacts for women, and that is not surprising because we have seen this before. But also when we look at women with disabilities, particularly with girls, and as the hidden care responsibility that is not only severe in many families and societies, care responsibilities for women with disabilities, but also the mothers and other women that play care role for their children with disabilities. And that is not evident or assumed automatically. And our education sector in last 2 years had to carry this burden, heavy burden, quite a lot. Women and girls are, in most cases, left behind. The data reveal that national responses have insufficiently addressed the needs of women and girls. Women were less likely than men to receive cash relief. And cash relief is important because in any crisis, the first response typically from member states, from countries are cash and food for work and this type of immediate incentive. And those incentives generally doesn't trickle down to women and girls with disabilities for different societal reasons, for cultural reasons. Sometimes they are not necessarily seen as a very visible presence in the family. They are invisible in many societies. And as a result, the formal benefit, the cash transfer programs doesn't benefit women with disabilities. And I would definitely look forward to look into this report and how can we relate this with the economy of scale in terms of our both policy and programming response. Women with our children and younger women and girls are essentially likely to be left out of government support, as I just mentioned, and the social protection schemes. Now, countries can use these findings to more effectively target their responses and particularly to reach out to those who are left behind. I look forward to leveraging the 2022 Disability Data Initiative's full report, and UN Women will continue our engagement with you all. Thank you very much for inviting us and for engaging with us, and we will continue this engagement not only for the event, but the report itself produced an excellent opportunity to look at it and use this for more of an operational response on the ground. Thank you very much. Over to you, Rosario.
Yes, thank you so much, Moyorul, for your fantastic presentation. Yes, I would like to remind all the panelists that you have 5 minutes. Please try to respect our time because we have service providers, and that's why we want to have all the event good as possible. Okay, now I would like to invite to Julia Constance Brown Miller from the World Bank. Please go ahead, Julia. The floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you everybody for your wonderful presentations. I am speaking from the World Bank's Women, Business and the Law project. In case you're not familiar, let me get the screen on here. So yeah, we've heard a lot about data on disability and gender and disaggregation and the gaps in the data. I want to speak a little bit about laws and policies and how they can address to this gap to mitigate these. So, as I said, the World Bank's Women, Business and the Law project has been around for about 12 years. And we, so for 12 years, the World Bank's Women, Business and the Law project has been measuring the gap in laws and policies and how they support or hinder women's economic participation. And we produce data across 52 years now. So from 1970 until 2022, we're showing legal reforms to better include women in the labor market. And we do this across 190 economies. And what we've continuously seen is that a better legal framework, so more equality under the law, also produces better economic outcomes, better development outcomes for women and for societies. But one limitation of our standardized assumptions, because we need to make sure that our data is comparable across the 190 economies. And so one limitation is that we assume that the woman in question is non-disabled. And to mitigate and overcome this limitation, we have now started pilot research on the rights of women with disabilities. This was part of the World Bank's 10 commitments on disability inclusive development. And so we have now 10 new research questions, how legal frameworks promote and hinder women's economic participation with regards to women with disabilities. So here we're looking at non-discrimination in the law, we're looking at parental rights, labor market inclusion, and violence against women. And so the first part of the research is how legal frameworks recognize multiple or intersectional discrimination of women with disabilities. We already heard a lot about statistics, about lower labor market outcomes and high rates of violence against women. And so we're looking how laws and policies can support women with disabilities. What we have found is that only 1/4 of economies worldwide explicitly mention multiple discrimination in their laws. You have a map of the world on this slide that shows in different shades of blues how inclusive the legal frameworks are. And so what we measure here is whether a gender equality law mentions women with disabilities and or a disability rights law mentions women, because again, we know that there is this multiple discrimination in both ends, and often women with disabilities have been kind of neglected from the disability rights movement as much as from the gender equality movement. And what you see on the map, or what you can see, is that the darkest shades, which means that this is the most inclusive legal frameworks, there are only 10 economies that mention women with disabilities and the gender equality as much as in the disability rights framework. And those are, for example, Austria, El Salvador, Korea, Turkey, and Zambia. And this is important because if you bring a discrimination claim to court, if the law doesn't recognize multiple discrimination, then women can either bring a gender or disability rights discrimination. But of course, in order to really show the full experience, it's important that a law be inclusive and mention both. And so in the interest of time, I will just very briefly go over our additional areas of research and ask you to stay tuned for the publication of this research. The first area is parental rights for women with disabilities. Here we're looking into laws, how they provide, for example, financial aid or extended maternity leave for women with disabilities. The second area is labor market inclusion for women with disabilities, where we're looking at reasonable accommodation mandates and employment incentives. And again, the existence of multiple discrimination on gender inclusive language is incredibly low. And finally, the topic of violence against women. Here I want to refer to my previous presenters. Jackie and Sophie mentioned the attitudes from women with disabilities about wife beating being justified. And we've also heard about the increase in domestic violence against women with disabilities from Rosario. So it's incredibly important that legal frameworks recognize that. So we're looking at domestic violence laws and whether or not they specifically mention with women with disabilities, and also whether services for survivors of domestic violence are accessible for persons with disabilities. And only 17 countries worldwide provide such accessibility in their law. So finally, I just want to invite you to check out our website. You have a QR code that you can scan with your mobile phone. You can also type or speak wbl.worldbank.org/en/disability. And as I mentioned, it's a research project that is still ongoing, but we will present our first research paper within the next weeks. Please, you're also welcome to email me. I would love to share it and engage with you. And talk about how we can design good laws and good policies to be gender as well as disability inclusive. So thank you so much for your attention, and please be in touch.
Thank you so much, Julia, for this presentation. Definitely it's a research project, and I will be emailing you in order to know what would be the progress in that. Now I would like to invite Claudia Capa from UNICEF. Please, Claudia, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Rosario, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I would like to start by congratulating Sophie, Jacqueline, and all those who work on this report. What an amazing way of making use of data. We spent the last 5 to 10 years addressing data gap. A lot of work has gone into developing new data collection instrument that can capture the population of persons with disabilities, avoiding stigmatizing languages, avoiding narrow definitions. A few years later, we are here today, and it's an opportunity for us to celebrate. Because this report is a testament to the many efforts made over the last few years in collecting data on persons with disabilities. If we go back to just 10 years ago, we would have not been able to report on the findings that Sophie and Jacqueline have shared with us today. So it's a moment to celebrate the advances made in producing new data. But when these data are produced, we now have a responsibility. The responsibility is to honor those data and all those who work hard to collect the data by analyzing the data, disseminate the findings, and most importantly, use the data to advance the rights of persons with disabilities. I'm a data person. There is nothing more frustrating to me than to see that once we collect the data, such data is not analyzed, is not disseminated, is not used. So I want to recognize that behind these surveys that were used by Jacqueline and Sophie for the analysis, there is the work of many national statistical offices. And I want to rectify an important piece of information. The surveys that were used for this analysis are not UNICEF surveys. These are nationally owned and nationally designed and implemented household surveys done by national statistical offices in their own respective countries. UNICEF provides financial and technical assistance, but these are not our surveys. These are the surveys of the countries where these people live. And collecting data is a very important critical step. So we have to praise the statistical offices of the countries, the organizations of persons with disabilities, and all those who ask for these surveys, implemented these surveys, and participated in the surveys, because they made today possible. It's really great to see these surveys data being used in this analysis. And clearly the survey data are not telling us anything new. They are confirming what persons with disabilities, their families, and all those working in the field already knew. Persons with disabilities, children with disabilities, continue to be deprived. But now we have the power of putting these deprivations and present the numbers, and the numbers have power. I just want to mention something. Of course, we need to continue to fill the data gap. We want more surveys, like the mixed surveys used today. We want more countries with data. We want countries to collect this data over time, not once. These data are meant to be used for monitoring progress, and therefore these data have to be collected at regular intervals. But as we continue to grow in terms of data sets, we also need to make sure we strengthen capacity for data interpretation and use. There is a translation process that needs to happen. What does it mean that women, for instance, with functional difficulties are less likely to access reproductive health? What can we learn from this data, and how do we connect this learning with policies, with advocacy, with programming? So we need to come together, data producers and data users, so that we make sure that these statistics do not just remain numbers, are really used to transform lives. So thank you so much, Sophie. Thank you, Jacqueline, and all those who work on this report. It's now our shared responsibility to take this report and its finding forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Julia. And it's very important, thanks so much, Claudia, and very important what you mentioned about the active role of collecting data, because definitely it's not only once, you need to collect data, you need to keep monitoring the data process. And it's also a role of the Organization of Persons with Disabilities and NGOs, not only of UN agencies. Well, first I would like to remind to all attendees that if they want to pose questions, they can do it in the chat box. I have been reading very interesting comments now. Well, now I would like to invite Vandana Chaudhary from City University of New York. Please, Vandana, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Hello all, good afternoon. So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to join this panel. And I would like to echo all the panelists so far in congratulating this report, and what a mammoth task that has been undertaken in this report. Tracing from data from 2009 to 2021 across 7 domains, 32 indicators, and 35 countries. So I think this is really a very crucial work done. So that's something I wanted to start with. And as someone who works in disability studies, as an academic with disability, who also is positioned from the Global South, researcher from the Global South working in the academia in Global North, I really see the value of this work and the need for the policy making to work with multiple stakeholders like academics, grassroots, DPOs, international organizations. So I think this is a great platform. So first of all, I do want to just say that, within disability studies, there has been, a lot of work done on feminist disability perspectives. And I think that's great to see how it, because a lot of the disability studies, theories and concepts, I mean, they, sometimes they just remain very theoretical. So it's really important to see how we can translate those theories and concepts into policy and practice. And one way it can be done, as demonstrated by the report, is through using an intersectional approach in data collection, in data analysis. And as I was saying, that the transnational feminine disability perspective really does underscore and shows how multiple systems of oppression such as sexism, ableism, and economic inequities interlock for women and girls with disabilities, and further marginalize them in their own very unique cultural context. So it's important for us to kind of see how disability, how feminization of gender poverty is taking place, how disability and poverty takes place, and how these gender relations, economic relations intersect with disability to create a unique reality or poverty for women with disabilities. So it's not just one dimension, it's multiple dimensions. It's gender relations, it's disability relations, it's economic, social, cultural relations. And drawing from my own ethnographic work on disability and poverty in rural India, I can really sort of attest to how cultural realities, especially marginalize women within the domestic sphere, but also in the public sphere, such that their economic opportunities are further shrink. Their economic opportunities shrink because of the cultural norms around what work they can do within the domestic sphere, both market as well as reproductive work. So there is a marginalization that they experience within the market, within the household, and within rural areas, especially. Also the report was highlighting that these deprivations are very significant, and some of it is also to do with the rural economy. And there is a greater exclusion of women with disabilities from the rural economy due to cultural norms of work that they can perform in the public sphere, but also lack of access and accommodations within the rural economy. And while there is more greater understanding of accommodations and accessibility within formal economic sector, that is really not the case within rural economies. And I think it also speaks to what the data, when the report is talking about in terms of disability and development gap. And in fact, it's very interesting finding that shows that there is a greater exclusion of people with disabilities or women with disabilities in higher income countries, as opposed to lower economically less developed countries. And I think some of that can be understood from the framework of relative poverty and absolute poverty, because in a lower economic, or less economically developed country, there is a situation of absolute poverty and collective deprivation, right? So their opportunities are missing for all, not just for people with disabilities, but there's a collective precarity in terms of infrastructure, road, basic needs. So in some way, the poverty is experienced collectively by people with disabilities and without, but of course, greater or deepening, that process of exclusion is deepened for people with disabilities. However, when the economies advance, which is what is happening in higher economically developed countries, the gap seems to be higher for people with and without disabilities. And I think some of that can be understood through relative poverty framework, because while there is greater development in terms of schools and health, they have not taken into account inclusion and access. So that's not gone into the development process due to the stigma or the kind of like worthiness or lack of worthiness that's attached to disability. So while the rest of the population, like non-disabled population, gets access to development, the people with women with disabilities get excluded. So that is, you know, that pattern of exclusion is, so we can't really say that they're more excluded than in the less developed countries. It's just that in less developed countries, there's an absolute, like, infrastructure is missing. But in highly developed or higher developed countries, there is infrastructure, but people with disabilities have been excluded. So there's a unique dimension, I think, that really this report is highlighting, you know, which really points to unique, you know, possibilities of how we can frame policies in different contexts. And I also want to just highlight from my fieldwork the very, very sort of like important need for social protection, you know, because as I was talking about limited work opportunities for women within informal sector, as well as a lack of opportunities within the familial domain, whether it is in terms of inheritance or access to marriage and you know, social protection that comes from being part of a familial unit, you know, that women are excluded from those you know, sense of securities, if you may. In that case, you know, due to those absences, it really becomes important to have greater social safety nets, pensions, cash transfers, so that women with disabilities don't fall through these cracks, right? So I know I'm running out of time. And then one last comment I wanted to make was in terms of digital divide. Of course, you know, it becomes very important for policymakers to think of digital access and digital justice, especially during COVID. We know that there has been an acceleration of digitalization of welfare systems, of information, of education. Everything has gone digitalized, right? We are even interacting on Zoom right now. But so it's become very, very like a crucial digital space. Access to digital, you know, realm is very crucial for well-being. So it's, whereas, you know, but it's also again intersectionally predetermined by economic resources and all other indicators, as well as accessible technology as well, right? So I think that exclusion from that.
I am really sorry. Could you please wrap up? Because
yes,
I am really sorry for the time. Sorry for that.
So just to wrap it up, I really was making a point for digital justice and gender inclusion in digital platforms for women and girls with disabilities. So, so thank you so much, and I think we can take more, questions during the Q&A. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Vandana. I'm so sorry. So sorry, but I mean, we have limited time,
yes, sure.
But thank you so much for bringing this perspective from the academy, especially from the disability and feminist studies. Thank you so much for that. And now I would like to invite our last panelist today is Gisela Berger from Humanity and Inclusion. Gisela, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for the invitation. And I'm an older lady with white hair and white skin, and I have glasses. Yes, I'm coming from Humanity Inclusion, and Humanity Inclusion has been working more than 40 years in development cooperation and humanitarian support in many, many countries. And of course, for Humanity Inclusion, it has always been a very important component as well to look at the importance on data and disaggregation of data. So, for example, in 2018, in cooperation with Leonard Cheshire, we did already research on the use of washing group questionnaire and research in development, but as well in humanitarian settings. And I would like to use this opportunity to share some, let's say, experience from the field about the importance of disaggregate data when we look into the field of sexual and reproductive health. Humanity Inclusion has the opportunity and the chance through a huge consortium project that is implemented in 16 countries with focus on sexual and reproductive health for women. Humanity Inclusion is one of the consortium partners. The others are mainly service providers, mass media organization, advocacy organizations. And we can see that all what you have mentioned, we can see in the field, all what you have mentioned as well, mentioned report, is matching with the reality in the field when we look into sexual and reproductive health. We see that in the field, women with disabilities have less access to information, less access to services. And we see in particular that the combination of the different, as you mentioned before, multiple discrimination leads to less opportunity to enjoy their right to sexual and reproductive health. When we look into sexual and reproductive health approaches and programs, we always have to look into 3 levels. The first one is demand creation, and all what's related to community-based and public health information sharing and changing of, let's say, restrictive norms and misconceptions and restrictive norms. So when we look into reproductive health, we know that it's very important to work as well on community level. Then we have the level of service provision, where we have to make sure that all groups of people, marginalized groups, including people with disabilities, and in particular, women and girls with disabilities, have access to quality services. And we look at the national ownership level. So when we look into the importance of data in all these different levels, we can say, of course, it's super important and it's wonderful to have such kind of report you presented. But on the other hand, we know we need as well data on local level. So when we look into demand creation, and we want to make sure that in prevention programs, information programs on sexual and reproductive rights for all, we want to make sure that people with disabilities and women are included. We have to collect data to find out, did they participate in community-based activities like focus group discussions, community dialogues? Could they hear the radio messages? Did they get the radio messages about sexual and reproductive health? When we look at service provision, of course, we need to know, do the people who come to the services or who can't come to the services, what are the reasons, we need to know the need of assistive device. So if we have a woman with disabilities being pregnant and has to come for antenatal care, and she can't come because she don't have crutches and it's raining season, we need to know, where are the women? Do we have sufficient data to make sure in future planning and in, let's say, comprehensive approaches, we address women with disabilities? And of course, as well on national level, national ownership level, we have to make sure that as well in the Ministry of Health, the colleagues are aware that data collection, disaggregated data collection is relevant to do planning and monitoring in the field when you want to ensure sexual and reproductive health services for everybody. So that's a bit where we say, of course, national data, very important, but we advocate as well that data have to be collected as well on local level. And another part, when we look from the health or service angle, we know that, of course, it's important to collect health information in the health information system data, and disaggregated data, and to include, for example, washing group questionnaire in routine data collection. But on the other hand, it's as well important to look from another angle. When we listen to WHO and the important criteria of quality in service provision, we will find that many of these criteria are criteria that ensure inclusion. So we have, for example, the important quality criteria of accessibility. We have about client-centered approach. So that means we as well have to advocate to include tools and functional questions, functional difficulty questions into quality management tools in services. I think I'm not expert in education, but I would say in health, you could say it's not only saying all data and national level or in the health data system, but as well when we do monitoring quality management in service, we have always to consider. For example, our service provider partner included washing group questionnaire into the client exit interviews, and it gives tremendous and very important information. Perhaps my last point, or two little points. We, of course, when we look into the health sector, sometimes it's tricky to train people on the use of washing group questionnaire, for example, because it's sometimes difficult for people to differentiate between prevalence approaches and diagnosis. So if somebody comes for contraceptives and is asked, do you have difficulties in seeing? That might be difficult if the interviewer is not very clear how to put this question and why to put this question. And my last point, perhaps, I think it has been mentioned in this report, but as well in the report from 21, as being an organization working as well a lot in humanitarian settings, we see that the big gap of difficulties in the field of psychosocial disabilities is a huge issue. We know in humanitarian settings, we have to assume the number of women, men, but in particular women and girls with psychosocial difficulties is very, very high. And of course, I think it has been mentioned already as a point that needs to be considered. And I think that's something we have to look at to ensure that in particular in crisis settings, and we have more and more settings of forced migration and conflict, looking at climate change. I think this is something that needs to be considered as well when we look at data collection and ensuring that we capture all people and make the invisible people really visible. And therefore, advocating for data collection as well on different levels. I would like to quote Hannah Cooper, when she says, what is not counted does not count. And I think that's a very important point. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Gisela, for this fantastic presentation. I think it would be great that you highlighted the issue of service provision. I mean, we cannot improve service provision for women and girls with disabilities if we don't collect data. It's very important. It seems to be, Elizabeth, that we don't have time for our question and answer section.
We have one question, so I think we can answer that one question. If I'll just read it out, and then whoever wants to answer can answer, because we only have 5 minutes left.
Okay.
So it is a question from Oxfam. Thank you for the interesting presentations. I would be interested to hear from the speakers their sense of what data says about women, young women with disabilities in leadership and movements that support women as leaders and policymakers, and not just recipients and subjects of policies and programs. And I'll just add as well, I'd like to know if anybody has any response on how we can work better with qualitative data, citizen-driven data, using and working with organizations of persons with disabilities to complement official statistics in our work. So I will open it up the floor. We have 5 minutes left, so please just 1 minute each to answer these questions and have a closing remark. Rosario, do you want to start?
Okay, yes, I would like to emphasize that it's very important to know that the reports that I also mentioned in my presentation demonstrate that definitely OPDs are able to produce reports based on evidence, on data. That's why it's very important to keep training people, keep doing capacity building to OPDs and especially to women and girls with disabilities. From International Disability Alliance, we have also doing these trainings with different youth with disabilities, especially young women with disabilities. This is definitely our mandate to train people, and also that they can do advocacy after this training, and they can also know more about how to collect data, how to produce reports, and how to monitor the SDGs, and also the implementation of the CRPD.
Thank you so much, Rosario. Anyone else? Would anyone else like to say something? Just open your mic and speak.
Yes.
Sophie?
Yeah, thank you. This is a very important question. And here, I think it underlines how important it is to use different kinds of data. So the quantitative data from national data sets we've used in the report we presented earlier sometimes is not suitable to ask very specific questions around, for instance, documenting the situation of women with young women with disabilities in leadership positions or in their roles in movements. So here, I think it's really key to have various stakeholders collect different kinds of data, including qualitative participatory data collected by OPDs, and that altogether we can present a picture that is as comprehensive as possible about the situation of women with disabilities.
Thank you. Claudia? Oh, sorry, someone else?
Julia here. No, thank you. I would love to add a small observation because it's exactly the right question that we're also trying to connect with our research on legal frameworks. And again, the legal framework policies are so incredibly important to bring marginalized groups into the spotlight. And so what we have seen at Women, Business and the Law is that in countries where the law is more gender equal, also more women are in parliaments. So again, law and outcomes are often related. And that's also now what we're trying to do for the inclusion of women with disabilities. And we do design our research questions with feedback from PDOs, of course. But yeah, again, really, we welcome your feedback because the design of policy is so important to really bring more people into the discussion.
Right. Also, I think just reckoning to the mixed method approach and how, both really can, be worked together, because with qualitative data or ethnographic data, it can really inform more, the quantitative instruments, like especially when we talk about intersectionality in terms of ethnic identity, because I think that really does determine access to resources. So other factors of intersectional marginalization can be introduced there.
Thank you, Vandana. Claudia, do you want to say anything, or Gisela?
Yes,
Sorry, go ahead. No.
Just to say that I wanted to underscore really the importance of thinking about the different data needs, because we cannot expect that through one data source or one data provider, we are going to be able to address all the data needs that we have. I also want to underscore the fact that if sometimes we don't have data, we might feel the urge of going ahead and collecting them ourselves. And I think it's a very noble attempt, but we also need to hold people accountable for their responsibilities when it comes to generating evidence. And governments and national statistical offices have an obligation to do so. So even if we are tempted to jump on and let's collect data, I think there is an important role that official statistics can play. So as we fill data gap, we also need to continue to demand data from those who have the responsibility of doing so, because persons with disabilities deserve the same attention that is given to statistics on the labor market, on the economy of a country, on everything else. So let's demand data from those who have the responsibility of doing so, because I mean, again, official statistics have an important role to play for accountability purposes. Thank you.
Thank you. And unfortunately, we do have to end on that very good point. And I really want to thank everybody, the sign language interpreters, international sign interpreters, Spanish, French interpreters, the captioner, Fordham University, UN DESA, and CBM Global for organizing this event, for all the panel. That was fantastic. And thank you all for participating. And we will share the recording sometime soon. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day.